just before we start, I'd like to say that, we're dedicating this conference or this competition to a friend of ours, Raymond Hobbs, who passed away just over 2 years ago. Ray was a professor at Trinity College at McMaster University. He was a reenactor. He was very generous with his time and his encouragement. And he served on the committee for History Symposium. We constantly used him as a speaker. And, what was incredible about Ray was, beyond being like probably the world's nicest guy, it was just the way he encouraged everyone and fanned the flames of their passion in the studying of history and encouraging them, to share what they've learned. So we thought it was fitting that we do this competition as a tribute to Ray. So we have 3 prizes today. The first prize will be chosen by the academic panel. You, the audience, get to choose the second prize, and then there's also a runner-up award. So all 3 of our brave, bold candidates will get a prize today. In the event of a tie, the people and the academic panel choose the same winner. The academic panel's choice will take first prize, and then the people's choice of the second. Then that doesn't make sense. Anyways, we'll sort it out. That there can't. I know what I'm going to say. So that if both choose the same top person, the one chosen by the academic panel will be the overall winner. The second place winner for the people's choice will take that award. All right. I'm tired of tripping over my tongue. So, order of presentation. First off will be Megan Buchanan, who will be starting at Western University in September. We have Melissa Wing from the University of Victoria and Megan Hamilton from the University of Waterloo. So Megan, I'm going to ask you to start in just a moment, if you can unmute your microphone there. And then when we complete this, then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then ask our judges to turn on their cameras, and they'll have an opportunity to ask Megan questions. And if there's a good question in the chat, then maybe we'll take the opportunity and I will bring that forward. So Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Megan Buchanan, and I'm going to be starting at Western University in September to do an MA in history, hopefully graduating next year, and going to be writing my thesis on commemoration and disobedience.
All right, so here we go.
So my research interest is in commemoration of the fallen of the 2 world wars, especially in how the men who were executed for whatever reason were buried and remembered. Seeing as that's a large topic, the focus of my master's work will be specifically on Canadians who were executed. Now, during World War I, there were 25 Canadians who were put to death while serving overseas during the Army. 23 were executed for desertion or cowardice, and 2 were executed for murder. As part of the increased perception of the effects of shell shock and PTSD, and after a public campaign, those who were executed for desertion and cowardice were posthumously pardoned by the UK, who was in charge of military justice during World War I. And this happened in 2006. However, that doesn't cover all of the people who were executed. One of the ones that wasn't was a man by the name of Driver Benjamin DeFer, who was convicted of murder and then shot after he, for some reason, decided to shoot Regimental Sergeant Major J.R. Scott in the back at a military park in 1916, I believe. Now, they are both buried in the same cemetery in Hazebrook, which is southeast of Calais and south of Dieppe. And they're actually buried like 3 things apart. As I said, he is one of the 2 World War I soldiers from Canada who were not pardoned because after his execution, because of what he did. However, he is still in a military cemetery with a military headstone, commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and by the Canadians in the virtual war memorial. Now, this leads to some questions. First, why was he buried with other soldiers who died in combat or by disease or otherwise? Now, why were he and the other soldiers who were convicted of crimes also commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission? Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission does have a policy of equality in death, which means, and so I'm curious as to what led to the decision to treat all these soldiers who died as equal, regardless of how they died. And overall, what does this tell us about the commemoration of war dead? And can we learn anything from this, from how they treated those who died? Different.
Thank you, Megan. You know what, that's extremely difficult thing to do in front of a live audience with those hard timings. So really appreciate your efforts there, and I hope the audience appreciates that as well too. So Renee, Tanya, and Graham, if you could turn your cameras back on. All right, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask Megan a question. I'll do it in the order your images reappeared. So Renee, you get to go first. So
thank you very much, Megan. I think that the whole set of questions that you have around how the living might look at the dead compared to the sort of policy of the equality of the dead is really interesting. And I know you probably haven't been able to you might not be able to answer this question at all, but the first question that I had was, did the families get upset when the 2 men ended up so close to each other?
Yeah, that I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole reason that I chose Driver de Fer is because he was born in Winkler, Manitoba, which is really close to where I grew up. Like, I grew up in Winnipeg and I'm still living in Manitoba, so that's why his story sort of resonated. And I have no idea how the families of either of them felt about it or how much they were told about what happened. Like, I know that in the case of some of the Americans who were shot for crimes during World War II, there was at least one case where the family did not know really what had happened until over 10 years later. And so I've seen Driver de Fer's service record, and it has, you know, the results of the court martial were all over the record. I have not been able to get to Ottawa to see the actual, you know, court martial records, but I can't imagine that the family of Regimental Sergeant Major Scott would have been all that happy about it if they were told the full circumstances. What they were told, I don't know. That he died, yes. What exactly happened? That's hopefully, I mean, I'm going to try and look for that, but at this point, there's no way of knowing. I know that there was a lot of controversy over the fact that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission did not let any of the bodies go back to the UK or elsewhere. And a lot of controversy over, you know, the shapes of the gravestones and all of that, but they did stand firm, and so the only casualties that are buried in the UK were those that died there because of disease or accidents during training or whatever the case may be.
all right, let's give Graham a chance to ask a question here. Graham?
Megan, it's a really interesting topic, and some other people have, Teresa Ecabelli and others have written about military executions, and I think it's interesting you're looking at people who were executed for crimes, which is something that's there hasn't been a lot on. Just in terms of your source material, what do you think are going to be the most important sources? I mean, is it? I know you're just a master's student. Is it possible to get into the CWGC archives, for example, to see what they're talking about around these issues?
Well, I know that I have poked around on the CWGC's online archival system, and there does seem to be a couple of files on that. The big issue is going to be, can I afford to get over to Maidenhead to actually do it? I am in a number of military history CWGC commemoration of the war dead Facebook groups, and so I'm hoping that I can find somebody in one of those groups who lives more locally that could go, and for the price of parking and a meal and photocopying, be able to go and get me what I need.
For sure, these are the things that we all do, that we all have to do.
And in terms
especially
of
now.
So I know that from what I've been able to find from my apartment here, there are a couple of things in Maidenhead. There's, of course, going to be a lot more about the court martial and all of that, and the two people involved in Ottawa. And I know as you probably know, there have been several books about the whole sort of Shot at Dawn situations, which will probably form some of the secondary reading that I do in terms of placing it all into context, why they didn't get pardoned, why he didn't get pardoned at the same time as the others did. And, even though I know that's way more of a case of back then they didn't know or didn't care about shell shock, and now they can look back and say, hey, this wasn't right. But it's still going to be part of the overall secondary.
Very good. Thanks, Megan. Tanya?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Hi, Megan. Lovely to see you here, and I hope you enjoy this process. I'm just wondering, in terms of the historiography of the topic, because there's been considerable work done, not considerable, but some work done on commemoration, particularly in the Great War, from a number of perspectives, and the whole question of military discipline and courts martial as well. So I know this is a preliminary look at how you're going to approach the topic, but how would this fit within the existing historiography? Is this kind of a blend of topics that haven't really been examined before? Is this uniquely looking at a Canadian perspective that hasn't been touched upon? Have you examined that at all?
A little bit. And from what I can see, there's been a lot of work on the commemoration overall, a growing amount of stuff on military justice, but not really a lot in terms of the blending of the two, especially from a Canadian perspective, as well as getting down into the differences about why the different soldiers were executed. I mean, in terms of, was it because of desertion, because they couldn't take it anymore? Was it because of murder? Was it because of refusing to go forward? From what I haven't been able to do a lot of work in that area yet. I've got still at this point got a full-time job and other stuff, and so I haven't been able to do a whole lot of deep diving into that part, but I'm hoping it'll be a blend of topics with a bit of a Canadian perspective.
Great. Thank you, Megan. So I'm going to ask if everyone can turn their cameras off, and Melissa, if you can turn yours on. Very good. Get this queued up again. All Right, Melissa, whenever you are ready.
Yes. So, hello, everybody. My name is Melissa Wing. I am currently in Victoria. I am going to the University of Victoria for my master's in history, expected to complete it at the end of the year. And my presentation today is called The Power of Sport, Canadian Forces-Based Chilliwack and the Chilliwack Community.
All right, here we go.
There is a hidden power held within sport. In Chilliwack, British Columbia, sport and recreation helped the military at Canadian Forces-Based Chilliwack establish a unique relationship with the surrounding community. From the end of the Second World War to the base's closure in 1995, we see the foundations of a positive relationship through sport and recreation. Camp Chilliwack, or as it's more commonly known today, Canadian Forces-Based Chilliwack, officially opened its doors to new military recruits in February 1942. And by the end of the following year, the base had reached full capacity and continued to grow until the end of the Second World War. In the immediate post-war period, the base was a shell of its former self. In 1946, to revive Camp Chilliwack, the Canadian military made the base home to the Royal Canadian School for Military Engineering. By the end of the decade, the RCSME brought in hundreds of young men and became a national hub for a multitude of training programs and specialty officer programs. Sport and outdoor activity became an everyday occurrence at the base. If there is a sport you can think of, the men of Camp Chilliwack probably had a team that could play it. Moreover, Camp Chilliwack sports teams and events were not confined to the base. Almost every sports team had a connection to the outside community. During the mid-1950s, the RCSME's Canadian football team helped the Chilliwack High School's Canadian football team get their start after two failed attempts in the previous decade. Captain G.W. Higgs, coach of the RCSME team, told the local newspaper in 1957, quote, "We want to let the people of Chilliwack see what football is like. We hope that this is the start of ours that will lead to a similar enterprise," end quote. The open invitation by the base to the community was nothing new. It was almost an unsaid assumption that whatever sport the community would want to play, the base would provide an opposing side and support a new league. During the Cold War, CFB Chilliwack faced a surge in personnel and families on base and were in desperate need of new facilities. The Shyam Center, a multi-purpose recreational facility, was a 17-year dream for the base and finally opened in June of 1971. Meanwhile, off base, the primary recreational facility in Chilliwack had closed permanently. As a temporary fix, CFB Chilliwack voluntarily opened the Shyam Center to the public on a limited basis. Base Commander Colonel David Carr saw an opportunity here, and in opening the recreational facilities to the public, in an interview with the newspaper, he said, "What the base and the YMCA can do together is for the good of the whole community." The Shyam option, as it was more commonly referred to, remained in effect until the base's closure in 1995. Sport and recreation helped humanize a heavy military presence at the physical center of Chilliwack. The bond through sport proved vital and provided a way for the base and Chilliwack to coexist as friends with little friction. Thank you.
Well done. You had about 3 or 4 seconds to spare there. So
Consistency is key.
I know when I've timed presentations in the past, when I do it live, I tend to talk much faster and all my timings are thrown off. So I appreciate the work and preparation that went into this. So Renee and Tanya, if you can turn your cameras back on as well. And then Graham, I'm going to let you start this time. So.
Wow, I want to talk about this for quite a while, but I'm not going to because we're on a tight schedule. You kind of threw me with your last remark. I thought it was really interesting. You talked about the bond through sport between Chilliwack and the local community. And I kind of didn't expect it to go that way. I thought you were going to talk maybe more about the relationship between sport and other aspects of military training, which is what I wanted to ask you about. So do you mind if I ask you about that?
Sure, go for it.
So how do these two things relate? Did the people who plan sports see it as part of the military training, or is it a recreational activity quite apart from the rest of military training?
Yes. So this whole presentation is part of a much larger project that was built as a website. And part of what I found through researching at the Chilliwack Museum and Archives was that the added bonus to sports as training was sports as a public relations tool. So, for example, the football team was created as a training mechanism during the 1950s, especially, and throughout military training in the States, football is used as a team building exercise and these other things. So at Camp Chilliwack, they had created a football team for training. And when they saw that the outside community was having trouble, they extended that olive branch and made that relationship. So at the end, it was never for the Camp Chilliwack teams or the military-based teams to win. And in fact, they lost a lot. It was more to just maintain a relationship and to allow for civilian teams that didn't have a league to sustain themselves to have that support. So it was more of an added bonus to a very strict training regimen.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you.
Tanya, you're up next.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, Melissa. I really enjoyed your presentation. And if my camera had been on, you would have seen me smile because I did my basic training in Chilliwack. And we started the day at 5:30 with physical training. And I thought, what could the instructors do to us? And 7 minutes later, I knew exactly what they could do to us. So I wanted to ask you about the military community and its relationship with the local communities, because it's multi-tiered, because you have the people permanently posted that, well, they're there, it's a transient community, but in various levels, they move every 2 to 3 years. You have a huge transient population who are either at the engineering school or CFOX. And then you have the schools as well. So are you examining sort of the base, if you will, and the local community, and also getting into schools and interactions as well? And what are your initial thoughts about the transient nature of the military community and continually having to rebuild that relationship?
Yeah, great question. In my research, I sort of base it around a couple of sports. So I have the full project on my other screen to answer your questions, but looked at football, the RCSME school and their SAPR programs and teams and things like that, hockey, the Shiam Center, and the random recreational programs. And from what I was seeing through sport, like you're saying, there's this constant overturn of not only personnel at the base, but also within the community. And so it's a constant communication. It's a constant relationship that continually needs to be worked. For example, with the Shiam Center, this 17-year dream passed through multiple different hands as it was being built. And the individual who was painting in my presentation was the one that stuck with it throughout the entirety of the project. But there is constant renegotiation. There's some really fun quotes from the public saying that the base better get their young men under control because they're escaping and getting into, the school. They're getting into the backyards of the school and they're hanging out with my kids, and I don't like that. So there was negotiations there, and yeah, it's been quite interesting to see. Unfortunately, that part of the project is quite small. Mostly it is specifically on the sports teams, what they did, and through newspaper research. So I'm only getting half the story, but I'd love to look into that more if I get the chance.
Thank you, Melissa. Renee?
Thank you very much, Melissa. What a fascinating project. A lot of what you were saying to Tanya's question covered a lot of ground of my immediate questions. I was really struck by the way that you finished that presentation when you talked about how the base and the engagement in sports kind of normalized a military presence. And of course, my first thinking, as Tom will know, I am very interested in misbehaving soldiers. So my first thought was, so they have this level of community engagement, but military people always seem to have kind of a bad reputation, deserved or undeserved, in the communities. So it's sort of, I guess, a two-part thing. Were the soldiers that were there, were they engaged in training the kids in sports? And my second question was, because of that that kind of persistent bad reputation that seems to dog military people. I was interested in that, in the kinds of tensions that might have come out of that particular relationship, that these are maybe not a good influence for our kids if they're training them. The photograph of the kids at the pool, that is such a great image. And I was looking to see, are the officers or the men, are they there? Are they training the kids? Are they with the children specifically?
Mhm. Yeah, so on the end part of your question there, the photo of the children at the pool is actually civilian children from off base. It was the first day that they had come in and were able to use the Shiam Center. The pool specifically was the big highlight. The main recreational facility that closed, it was the main indoor pool. So they're really wanting that indoor pool space. But back to the rest of your question. From my research, it just seemed sports was great because it got it got personnel at the base, and specifically the RCSME sappers, into shape, working as a team and out of trouble. And so there was a strict regiment from sun up to sundown of having something to do. And often I see in either the newspaper articles or the primary sources that I have access to mention of, we have to keep these men busy, otherwise there's going to be a problem. And same with the Shiam Center moving into the 60s and the 70s, the personnel on the base who were permanently living there or part-time or there for long periods of time, leadership on the base was concerned that their children are going to get into trouble and they needed something to do as well. So not only military personnel getting into trouble, young men, but the children of these people who have lived there for so long, them getting into trouble and causing a bad reputation for the base, which was another trigger for creating the Shiam Center and giving these kids something to do in recreation. The sports that this base had was incredible. And a photo that I couldn't include because I couldn't find it was of a gymnastics team. So the base had a gymnastics team and they're in a giant pyramid and they played everything, and that seemed to keep them quite busy.
Great. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you.
So if you can all turn your cameras off, and then Megan Hamilton, turn yours on. There you are. All right, give me a second. I'll share my screen again.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Hamilton, and I'm currently working on my Master of Arts degree in History at the University of Waterloo, and I'm scheduled to graduate at the end of August. So my presentation for today is called Barred from the Archives, C.P. Stacey, the Dieppe Raid, and British Canadian Historical Liaison.
All right, here we go.
How do you solve a puzzle when you can only see half of the pieces? This was the issue that Charles P. Stacey, the Canadian official historian of the Second World War, faced when trying to write the Canadian version of the Dieppe Raid. Official histories provide the foundation for national narratives. The Canadian scheme for an official history of the First World War had been an utmost failure, a problem to avoid as Canada joined the war in 1939. The solution was a young Canadian historian by the names of Charles P. Stacey. In 1940, he was sent to the Canadian military headquarters in London to begin collecting material for the future official history of the war. In 1942, an Allied force that was largely Canadian conducted a medium-sized raid on the French coastal town of Dieppe. The aim was to practice for the future invasion of Europe while also keeping the Germans guessing. For multiple reasons that have been debated extensively by previous historians, the raid was a disaster. 55% of the Canadian forces involved were either killed, wounded, or became prisoners of war. The Dieppe raid remains a sore spot in the Canadian narrative of the war. For Stacey, the Dieppe raid was his first experience in recording active warfare. However, with no advance warning of the plan, Stacey was forced to rely on post-action interviews and a convoluted paper trail. Stacey later wrote, quote, Dieppe provided me with the heaviest job of historical research that fell to me during the war. Putting together documented narratives of it took all the time I could spare from other tasks for the better part of 2 years, unquote. One of Stacey's biggest issues was his dealings with the British Cabinet Office, who were the gatekeepers of Britain's wartime archives. Until late 1947, the British Cabinet Office was generous in allowing Canadian historians access to their archives in London. In early 1948, however, the British began to place heavier restrictions on the material deemed above military level or private to the government. This tightening of access demonstrated a reluctance by the British government to release uncensored wartime records. This struggle for access lasted until 1950 and necessitated diplomatic maneuvering on both sides of the Atlantic. In his attempt to solve the Dieppe puzzle, Stacey was forced to rely on a complicated historical liaison process that left his most important archival research in the hands of British historians, requiring him to ask the right questions and provide suitable guidance. Recently released correspondence files from the Canadian Department of National Defence highlight the degree to which the writing of Canada's official histories of the Second World War were bogged down by the secretive temperament of the British Cabinet Office. Since Stacey's official account of the Dieppe raid was published in 1955, historians have been unable to reach a coherent historical account of the Dieppe raid. My research argues that this problem stems from the prohibitive actions of the British Cabinet Office in the decade after the war's conclusion. Thank you.
Wow, also with time to spare. Well done, Megan. We'll give our panel a chance to turn their cameras on. Renee, no, I guess it's Tanya. You start first this time. I'm trying to keep track of my mind here. Sorry.
That's okay, Tom. It puts the pressure on you to think of a question really quick. Thank you for that, Megan. Very interesting topic. I've studied Dieppe quite a bit and interviewed some personnel, including the Polish destroyer that was there. I'm just wondering then, were there any provisions in any visiting forces agreements between Canada and Britain regarding exchange of materials? And was this something that was solved solely at the historian level, or did it require a diplomatic effort from external affairs, for example, or were they even interested?
So Stacey really put the work in during the wartime years to build that relationship with the British Cabinet Office, and he had a great working relationship with them. And things were going quite smoothly just at the historical level until 1946. Then we start to see the British Cabinet Office starting to tighten down on their restrictions. 1947. This really starts to pick up in terms of intensity, in terms of what the British will allow Canadians access to. And a conference in early 1948 was really where things peaked. And between 1948 and 1950, we see this taken almost all the way up to the prime minister level. They did save that as a last resort, and they didn't end up using it, but Department of External Affairs was involved on both sides of the Atlantic. Our High Commissioner to Britain was used, all these different channels. Stacey was really jumping through a lot of hoops to try and make this work. And eventually they came to a compromise where he had a direct contact over in the Cabinet Office who was able to answer his questions. But like I said, he always had to provide, guidance and questions when it would have been a lot more useful for him to be over there himself or his own liaison officer to be over there. So, they did come to a compromise, but on the Canadian side, it was eventually decided to just let it lie and to move on and do what they could because the British were really, really quite stubborn about this. And interestingly enough, the Americans were not. The Americans kind of took a sidestep from it and stayed out of it, but they were perfectly willing to see the Canadians have access to those high-level documents where the British were not.
Great, thank you, Megan. I've lost track of my order, so I'm just going to say, Graham, if you can go next.
Megan, thanks. The official historians almost always come in for a drubbing, right? And I'm wondering, how do you situate your work then? Do you see yourself as mounting a defense of Stacey or putting Stacey in context, or how do you feel about the work you're doing?
Yeah, and yes, I know there's been it's been up for debate, the longevity of the official histories and where those lie now. And the documents that my research is based on are recently released. So I was working with Dr. Roger Sardi on this, and to me, this is kind of a new it's adding to the historiography. And I would see this probably in Stacey's defense, because, we're looking at what Stacey wrote and then what subsequent historians wrote, like Brian Villa and David O'Keefe and people like that. And now that we have these additional documents, I think that this just gives us a clearer picture about the issues that Stacey was dealing with. And I would say that this comes out in a bit of his defense. And maybe I wasn't thinking along those lines, but I think that this just reveals how much work he had to do and how he really stuck with it throughout those years to get those histories published.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Renee?
Thank you very much for that presentation, Megan. Fascinating. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for CP Stacey, so I'm glad to see somebody come to his defense. A very simple question. I know very little in some ways about the diplomatic wrangling, but the way that you presented it really seemed kind of conspiratorial. I mean, very in keeping with the temper of the times in the 1940s and everything that was going on globally. But I'm interested in what kind of justifications were given to Canadian delegations and Canadian officials about why they were not allowed to see documents about Canadian citizens. I'm wondering how they justified that kind of the locking down of information.
Yes, and you hit it on the nose there, that the fact that we were looking, the Canadians were looking for documents that were about Canadians, and that was their biggest play, is that they needed to see those documents that pertain to our national narrative. And the British really wiggled around it, and it did seem a bit like a conspiracy. And they didn't really fully come out and say, well, we don't want you releasing any bombshells that we don't know about. That was the whole thing, right? Is that they had millions of pages of documents in their archives that had not been, censored or ranked in terms of secrecy and things like that. So they just kept using kind of they wiggled around it, and they did kind of eventually start using the fact that, we don't know everything that's there, and we can't have that being published without us knowing exactly what you're talking about. And, Stacey was really good at trying to make compromises and trying to work with them, and trying to, have the backing of the Americans. But it was really interesting to read those documents and just to realize how much work went into those official histories. We don't really realize that, but it was so politically tied at the time that I think they're pretty significant products of their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Megan, I have a first. We have a question from our viewing audience for you. So this is Rob, who points out that his uncle was a survivor of the Dieppe raid. And he asks, he wonders if the British were embarrassed by the failure of the raid. Do you have a sense for that?
So I mean that there's a whole literature on Dieppe, and Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten is a big character in that. So there's different historians take different takes on that, and I wasn't necessarily trying to jump into that argument and debate, because it was a big debate. When Mountbatten came and visited Canada, I think in the 60s, he was booed by Dieppe veterans. It was a really big sore spot in Canadian history because we, had such a huge casualty rate at that point. And I think there was a little bit of, the British were unsure about how they should sell this. And interestingly enough, when Churchill wrote his memoir of the war afterwards, he wrote a couple pages on Dieppe and how he wrote that. He sent that draft to Lord Mountbatten to have him read it over, and Mountbatten went on a rage and completely rewrote it. And by the time he sent it back to Churchill, Churchill had moved on to the next thing. And actually Mountbatten's version got published in Churchill's memoir. And Mountbatten was a strong advocate for connecting the Dieppe raid to the success at Normandy. And, not everyone agrees with that. So there are a lot of different opinions. And what my research is arguing is that the fact that Stacey didn't have that direct access directly after the war has really hurt historians' ability to come to a consensus, as well as there's not a lot of documents on it. We're not exactly clear on how the revival of the raid went and all those kinds of things. So yeah, thanks for that question. That was great, Rob.
All right, thank you, Megan. Appreciate that. It's interesting. Our friend Ewan quoted Mountbatten in the chat. He said, I have no doubt the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe. So there we go.
Yes, and Stacy didn't go as far to agree with that. So there's, like I said, lots of different opinions on how that happened.
Great. All right. Thank you, Megan. Our judges, once you have had an opportunity to enter your scores, if you can turn your cameras back on. And then Chris, if you could start the poll on the live chat. And then I have some paperwork to do, but I'd like to see some faces and movement on the channel before I turn my camera off. So if we don't go entirely dark. There we go. Hi, Graham.
I don't. Those are three outstanding topics.
All right, I'll let you three chat between yourselves, or even invite the panelists to turn their cameras on and participate in that chat. And I'm going to turn my camera off for a moment and go do what I have to do. So
They were, I agree, Graham, that was just excellent. Three really wonderful presentations, and the topics were all so different, and it was, that was great. I learned a lot.
Megan, I found your comment about official history interesting. I remember one person I studied under said when you read Stacy, you have to read what he doesn't say, that there's a lot more to it, and you have to study it. You don't read it. And he was, of course, bound by certain conventions at the time and so forth that is within official history. But I found that a very interesting observation on your part.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's all of CMHQ's reports are online, and it's really interesting to go through and see the things that they're writing about on there, and the things that didn't make it into the official histories, and topics like morale that Stacy, he didn't really have time to touch on, and now are coming to light through historians' research now. But exactly, I think it's really important to remember that he was under political constrictions, as well as just page limits and things like that.
Page limits. Perish the thought. Melissa, it's funny. I had another thing I was thinking about when you were speaking. So I researched the War of 1812, very different time, but there's such weird, wonderful parallels between the way that communities interact with encampments and forts. And one of the things I know that a lot of commanders were worried about was actually that communities would have a bad influence on the soldiers. Was there any of that kind of discussion, like, oh, these people in Chilliwack, man, they're gonna corrupt all of our good men?
There was one particular instance where I saw in a diary where this one commander at the RCSME was getting frustrated by some comments by like a local mom group about how these soldiers were getting off base and were going to cause trouble. And it was only one sentence, but it was something like, well, you don't know what kind of trouble your kids cause, so keep to yourself. And this is just him ranting, but I thought it was quite funny. I wish I could find more of it. The documentation I had access to was limited, but I'm going to revisit the project and hopefully find out more.
Yeah, Megan Buchanan, I found your overall discussion about commemoration of war dead really fascinating, because for really a lot of people, that whole concept is linked to the recent war in Afghanistan and how the remains of Canadians that were brought home were treated. And they, many of them don't realize that really until 1969, where a soldier, sailor, Air Force personnel fell, generally was where they were buried. And it was very rare for remains to be brought back to Canada. So that is such an interesting aspect of that the people back in Canada could not mourn a body or their loved one. They had to do it by going to a memorial that was erected in their communities.
Yeah, and that was one of the big complaints about the CWGC's policy was, that not a lot of people would have been able to afford to go to France or Belgium or Gallipoli or wherever to visit the graves, and even from the UK, they might not have been able to afford to go over. And so that was a big part of why a lot of people were complaining that they weren't going to be able to properly mourn their husbands, their brothers, their sons, because they weren't given the bodies back. And especially for the families of the men who were missing, that that was a big reason for the huge memorials like Thiepval and the Menin Gate and all that, so that there was a place, if they could get over, for them to go and see that, yes, my husband's name is here, he is remembered, even if we're not sure where his body is. And in my readings about that organization, it seems that up until then, there hadn't been a whole lot of official, let's treat every soldier who died, from the newest private to the field marshals, as somebody worthy of a separate burial in the military. Like, I know that if you go far enough back, they were just all stuck in a mass grave, and the only people who got real graves were the leaders, the people that everybody would have known. And so to be able to say that it doesn't matter whether you died on day one after an accident or you were, Kitchener, he's buried in the same sort of grave as everybody else.
Yeah, that's
And
actually interesting, because if you look at the development of the staffs in the Canadian divisions, eventually they had a small group that were just involved in graves registration, which was
Yeah.
a big aspect of that, is who was buried where,
Yeah.
because the graves that they ultimately found themselves to under, well, I guess it was the Imperial War Graves Commission initially, were not necessarily where they were first buried. So there was a lot of movement of them afterwards.
No, I mean, because all of that's really dependent on the action around, and did they die in the trenches, or did they die at a hospital, or did they so that's why you have the concentration cemeteries, and that's why you have a whole bunch of communal cemeteries. Like, one of my great uncles is in a Commonwealth plot within a cemetery that belongs to the town near Lens. And so there are lots of places, a lot more places like that than people realize, where they made arrangements with the towns to be able to bury some of these soldiers within their communal town cemeteries. But the whole, I mean, and to think it all started with one man, Fabian Ware, who was working on an ambulance and couldn't stand all of the bodies just not getting buried, and so deciding to do something about it led to all of war cemeteries as we know it, basically.
All right. Do we want to know the results? We have both scorecards, so let's wait.
Can I just say Tom first?
Yeah.
It was great listening to all the presenters today, and I just want to say congrats to everyone.
Yes,
It's so
congrats to
interesting
everyone.
hearing such different topics and presentations. I'm really glad we got to do this together.
Yes.
So I also really want to echo that as well, and thank our three judges for taking the time to join us and being here and asking us such awesome questions.
Yes, and thanks to the
Pleasure.
judges, and thanks to Tom for hosting and moderating it, and to the organization for allowing us the opportunity in the first place.
Well, in turn, I'm deeply appreciative, and I'm sure I echo the sentiment of our audience. I think all three candidates did an outstanding job, and we're really, really impressed with your presentations. And then also our judges, thank you. Your questions were very, very good and well received as well. So we have 3 awards. So the first one is going to be the first prize that chosen by our academic panel. The results were extremely close, but I'm pleased to say, Megan Hamilton, you have won the overall prize. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And then the People's Choice Award will be Melissa Wing. So congratulations, Melissa. And really, third place is still a significant achievement, Megan Buchanan. So congratulations to you as well. So thank you so much to everyone. Really appreciate your efforts. There's lots of great encouraging comments in the chat. So if you ever have the inclination, go back and watch the replay of the competition, and then you do get a chance to see the live chat and what people were putting in there as well. So we'll be in touch with each of you and find out the best way to get you your scholarship or prize money. So well done. All right, so I have some quick instructions. We're going to transition. So I'm going to stop the live stream and stop this Zoom call so that we can have 2 distinct recordings on our YouTube channel for the archive. So we're going to stop this and then pretty much immediately reopen the live stream, but allow Carla Jean to come into the room, who's going to moderate the discussion. And if our panelists need a quick comfort break, there's a good time to run off to do that too. So we'll be right back. I'd suggest you refresh the channel periodically to see when the new live stream starts. So once again, thank you everyone, and congratulations to our 3 great competitors. Take care.
Congratulations, everybody.